Why does US authorizing sanctions haunt every country in the world? Since 2014 to most recent 11th round of sanctions in 2023, US has rendered Russia out of the global trade network. But what gives US this immense power? And why are America's sanctions so effective that even major nations in the world hesitate to rebel against them? One of the answers to this would be the dominance of US dollar as global reserve currency. For decades, the US dollar has reigned as world's reserve currency. Even when two nations say India and Indonesia trade, their transactions are often settled in US dollar, even if the said economic exchange does not concern US. Its universal acceptability means every transaction done in dollar has to pass through US financial system, which gives US an unparalleled control. If US blocks a country's access to this system, it effectively cuts them off from the international trade. But how did dollar earn this crown? And how has US managed to hold on to it? Hi everyone, you are watching Dialogues in Deep and more about us in the end of the video. The dollar story starts with the decline of British pound sterling during World War I. During the first half of the 20th century, the British pound sterling held primacy in world trade. As UK was the primary exporter of manufactured goods and services, it single-handedly invoiced 60% of the global trade. Initially, UK pegged its currency with gold, and when in 1871 Germany joined the gold standard, many countries followed, and it resonated into what was called as the strongest phase of global gold standard. To make it understandable, gold standard means a currency's value is directly tied to the price of the gold, essentially meaning that you can trade your currency for a set amount of gold at any time. As the World War I started, the gold standard started crumbling. As European nations required money for fighting the conflict and their own money was not sufficient enough. By that time, US was ready to enter the world stage after consolidating itself for more than a century. In 1910, America shared 35% of the world's industrial capacity, whereas Britain and Germany stood at 15 and 16% respectively. US spent over $20 million of its own money and lent $9.5 billion to its allies in World War I. This number grew to $50 billion in World War II. War left European economies into shambles, and US was still standing with its economy intact. In addition to that, composition of European industrial units also changed. For instance, British economy had been heavily geared towards the war production, constituting 55% of the GDP in 1944, and its exports in consumer products drastically decreased. In this, US found new ways to increase its lending to Europe in the form of new instruments like Lend-Lease Act, which made Britain and its allies dependent on US even for consumer goods. During the interwar periods, many attempts were made to boost the economies of European nations. But as the attempt to revive the gold standards failed, the countries attempted competitive devaluation. This means making their exports cheaper by lowering the price of their currency, even if that meant harming your neighbor's economy. It was called a beggar thy neighbor policy. Even before the World War II ended, countries realized that they required a huge amount of money for the after war reconstruction and didn't have enough gold left, as much of that was paid to US to fund the war. In America, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a conference was convened signing the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 by the representatives of 44 countries, in which all European nations decided to peg their currency to US dollar, and US dollar was backed by gold. The exchange rate was set to 1 ounce of gold is equal to 35 US dollar. So you must be wondering, why did those nations agree to these conditions? The primary designer of the Bretton Woods Agreement were John Keynes and Harry Dexter White. The former was a British economist and the latter a chief international economist of US Treasury Department. Keynes' hope was to establish a powerful global central bank called the Clearing Union and issue a new international currency. However, White's plan envisioned a more modest lending fund and a greater role of US dollar rather than creation of a new currency. In the end, the adopted plan took ideas from both, leaning more towards White's plan as it had US backing it up with world's largest gold reserve. US at that time had accumulated two-thirds of the world's gold reserve. This allowed nations to increase their money supply and accessing US financial markets to infuse growth in their economies. And this is where the story really begins. With the Bretton Woods Agreement, the use of US dollars started for settling foreign trade transactions, and the system was desirable as US allowed the conversion of dollar into gold at will. At that time, holding dollar meant holding gold. But US knew sustaining this desirability for dollar was the important part of the job, so as not to end up like British pound sterling. For this, US made two major moves. First was to ensure supply of dollar in international market. US supplied dollars under the Marshall Plan of 1948 for post-war reconstruction. Also, the institutions established under Bretton Woods Agreement, that is IMF and World Bank, both used dollar as a medium of exchange, means every assistance made or paid has to be in US dollar. To tell you briefly, the purpose of IMF was to monitor exchange rates and identify nations that needed global monetary support. And the World Bank, initially called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was established to manage funds available for providing assistance to countries that had been physically or financially devastated by World War II. Initially, the system was operating as planned. Japan and Europe were still rebuilding their post war economies, and demand for US goods and services and dollar was high. In 1960s, European and Japanese exports became more competitive with the US exports. America's share in world output decreased, and so did the need of dollars. America was facing number 1, deteriorating balance of payments, which initially the US government believed that the deficits demonstrated US leadership in providing expanding markets and finances. Secondly, high military spending and foreign aids as US was financing Korean and Vietnam wars and other small and big conflicts around the world. US circulated more dollars than the gold to back it up, which led to the increase of dollar supply around the world, believing that all will not come at once to redeem their dollars. As the result, around the world, inflation rose. So the question was, how long could the United States afford huge deficits without harming its own economy? And if the United States reduced its deficits, who would provide with the additional liquidity to allow the world economies to continue growing? The trust in US dollar started dwindling as nations started exchanging gold for their collected dollars. US gold reserves fell very quickly. Following failed attempts to save the system, President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold in August 1971, shocking the whole world and marking the beginning of the end of Bretton Woods exchange rate system. After months, as the Group of 10 retaliated, negotiations took place. The Group of 10 industrialized democracies agreed to a new set of fixed exchange rates centered on the devalued dollar in December 1971, which was called as the Smithsonian Agreement. But it did not sustain for long. 15 months later, in February 1973, speculative market pressures led to several devaluation pressures on the dollar. In March 1973, the Group of 10 approved an arrangement wherein 6 members of the European Community tied their currencies together and jointly floated against the US dollar, a decision that effectively signaled abandonment of Bretton Woods' fixed exchange rate system in favor of the current system of floating exchange rates. This is where the second move comes into play, which sealed the dollar's future to dominate the world. It was the petrodollar. It is the term used to denote the dollar earned from selling petroleum. Dollar and petroleum has a very romantic relationship. After dollar became a free floating currency, there was no one in the world that would restrict countries to abandon dollar as a medium of exchange. US had already recognized the role which petroleum was going to play in world's development. By 1960s, petroleum had replaced coal as the source of energy, and there was more than half of the world that was still underdeveloped. Although US became the largest producer of oil in 1875, but it recognized its limitation in producing oil. It was much later when the Arab world started producing oil because of not having appropriate technology. Then the United States made the petrodollar agreement on 8th of June 1974 with Saudi Arabia, according to which Saudi would sell its oil exclusively in dollar. In return, US promised number 1 its military support for security of Saudi's oil fields, secondly technology for the better extraction of oil, and lastly exclusive access to America's financial markets for investing the extra dollar earned. This move was a win-win for both the countries. And soon after Saudi, the whole Arab world accepted dollar for their oil. This move ensured that the dollar was still desirable for other countries as it could buy them the most precious resource of the planet. Secondly, the US was able to run significant trade deficits as petrodollar was reinvested in US economy. This helped US maintain a strong bond market and lower the cost of borrowing, benefiting its economy. The story does not end here. Now, the US had to ensure that this system, which had been created, does not lose its relevance at any cost. This was ensured by world financial institutions, that is, IMF and World Bank, which withstood the fall of Bretton Woods system. These institutions, in the name of working to stabilize the global financial system and promoting economic growth, try to align global economic system to America's needs. Secondly, control of US over the SWIFT. It stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It's a secured messaging network that allows bank and other financial institutions to communicate and send instructions for transferring funds. In simple words, it's a system which allows two individuals of different nations to transfer money internationally to each other. So every country has to use this network in order to do transactions in international financial system. This is the reason why US sanctions appear to be so strong, as US may exclude any country from the system, rendering that country unable to make transactions in international trade. Thirdly, US has from time to time eliminated any threats that stands in the way of dollar dominance, as has been seen in the case of Iraq in early 2000s under Saddam Hussein, who began selling its oil in euros rather than US dollar. This move to ditch dollar proved fatal for his regime. Countries like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela are the worst hit example of US exercising its influence. In addition to the previously created scenarios, the use of dollar was popularized by what is known as a network effect. Since there is a large network of people who wants the dollar, each individual in the network is more likely to use it to trade with everyone else, strengthening the dollar's demand. Also, the US financial markets are the largest and most open in the world. This means that organizations with a lot of dollar are able to buy and sell a lot of financial assets, making huge transactions that could cause problems in smaller markets, but which US financial markets can easily handle. So why is US willing to go to such lengths to save dollar dominance? This is because it makes it cheaper for the United States to borrow money, as it is free from the effect of devaluation that would increase their debt liabilities. Secondly, it results in high investment in US financial markets and treasury bonds, as all central banks and financial institutions have their accounts in American banks, and they park their excess money in US treasury and financial markets, giving US access to world's largest funds. And thirdly, the United States gets a diplomatic advantage. It can pressure any nation like Iran with financial sanctions which limits their ability to conduct international trade. Of course, the US dollar's global role won't necessarily last forever. Say if inflation rates get out of control and people lose confidence in dollar, or if US share in world's economy and trade declines, and if US government allows its debt to grow too large. But it would take a long time before the currency of any other country could replace it. So, key takeaway that you can take from this dialogue would be there are four major steps that made US dollar so strong. First was the establishment of Bretton Woods system, which helped dollar to make a grand appearance on the world stage. Secondly, the petrodollar agreement helped in sustaining dollar's demand. Thirdly, America's control over international institutions like IMF and World Bank also adds up to its strength. And lastly, phenomena like network effect, which has made dollar too big to fail. This is the reason why even if the countries like China may talk about de-dollarization, but they don't take a concrete step, because China itself has world's largest dollar reserve of 3.2 trillion dollars. However, it cannot be denied that countries do are attempting to diversify their exposure to dollar. As in 2000, when dollar's share in world reserve currency stood at 70%, it has fallen to about 60% in 2023. If you would like to read in detail about the establishment of dollar's power, there are some articles attached in the description box. Do check them out. And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this dialogue, don't forget to like and subscribe and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for more such interesting content.